Well, thank you everyone for joining us on the eve of the 80th anniversary of the formation of the Chifley Government. We're here tonight to talk about John Curtin, the person, the leader and the nation builder. And I'll be joined by our guests, Dr. Toby Davidson and Dr. Liam Byrne in just a few minutes. But first of all, on behalf of the Chifley Research Centre, I'd like to welcome you all here, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we're all coming from tonight. The office of the Chifley Research Centre is located on the land of the Ngunnawal people, and I am speaking to you tonight from the land of the Dja people of the Kulin Nation in the state of Victoria. We'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the lands from where we're speaking tonight, along with the lands from which our panellists are joining us and from where you're all joining us tonight. And we'd like to pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Well, tonight, when I'll just ask our guests to join us by video if they possibly could, because I've been back and forth. First of all, I'd like to welcome Dr. Toby Davidson. Toby is a scholar of Australian literature and an award-winning poet, and he's currently based at Macquarie University. He is, of course, the great-grandson of John Curtin. His latest book is Good for the Soul, John Curtin's Life with Poetry, and it's published by UWA Press. Available in all good bookstores, I believe, Toby. And for those who go online to the UWA site, there is actually a Chifley discount, I believe, if you punch in the code Chifley15. But Toby's book traces the impact of poetry on the life and speeches of his great-grandfather. And John Edwards, who many will know as the author of John Curtin's War, and who's been a previous guest on our Chifley Conversations, describes Good for the Soul as a unique, patiently researched and fascinating re-evaluation of Australia's revered wartime Prime Minister. Liam Byrne completed his PhD at the University of Melbourne and works with the ACTU and has been, since 2019, its historian. He's written for publications such as The Guardian, The Age, Kill Your Darlings and Overland. He's also the author of Becoming John Curtin and James Scallon, The Making of the Modern Labor Party. So I'd like to start off by saying that tonight we'll be trying to look at aspects of John Curtin that may not be known to many of us in great detail. There's certainly many things that many of us will know about, but how much do we really know about him, and what can we learn from the things that are perhaps less focused on among his life? He's one of our most studied prime ministers in historical terms, and several themes reoccur in common knowledge of him and of his life's work. And they're the themes of redemption, of resilience, and of reconstruction, with a particular focus on Curtin as the stoic wartime leader who died tragically several weeks before Japan surrendered to the wartime allies. We'll be revisiting some of those themes tonight, but we also want to look beyond them to what nourished the personal John Curtin, and also to the post-war legacy he left, something which he planned with great deliberation from his first days in office in 1941. On his gravestone bears the words, "His country was his pride, his brother man his cause." And I'd like to begin, if we could, by playing the conclusion of Curtin's broadcast to Australians of 8 December 1941, where he announced the declaration of war on Japan.
I think, Daisy, you might have to unmute yourself to get the sound. Yeah. I don't know if you could hear that. I couldn't hear that.
That's all right. I'll read the sound after.
Absolutely no worries. That may have just come up with the sharing of the screen there. I'll just start that again.
Could you try and replay, just because the
yeah, just coming through just now. No worries.
Thank you, appreciate it.
It looks like the technology might not be up to playing the sound. So we might have to go for second best, Toby. If Daisy, if you could just freeze the video, and I'll read the important bits. Curtin concludes the broadcast to the nation by saying, "Men and women of the Commonwealth of Australia, it is my solemn duty tonight to sound a tocsin. I proclaim a call unto you, and I do it in the words of Swinburne. Come forth, be born and live, thou that hast help to give, and light to make man's day of manhood fair. With flight outflying the sphered sun, hasten thine hour and halt not till thy work be done. God bless you all and thank you." Well, I apologise that we weren't able to bring you the sound, but Toby, let's start off. Why was poetry so important to John Curtin, and was this particularly unusual for the time in which he lived?
Yeah, thanks so much, David, and thank you to you all and to the series for having me on just on the 80th anniversary of the foundation of the Curtin Government. Yeah, it's quite a large question, and I have my own interest in poetry, of course. And in Australia, we don't really do literary biographies at all. You know, you can get the literary Churchill or the literary Roosevelt and things like that from other countries, but we don't do it very much in Australia, let alone a poetic biography. But as I started to delve deeply into his work and into his life and the things he'd written as well, with the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library at Curtin University, I thought there would be enough to give a seminar about, or maybe to write a short paper about, or something like that, because I knew in some of these big wartime speeches he had done this. He had quoted the British poet Algernon Swinburne's poem, The Eve of Revolution, which was a poem from his youth, and he used a lot of this sort of revolutionary type poetry that he'd learned. He sort of then reused it for the war and I've just got a little bit here from the book itself, which gives the press reaction to that quote at the end from the Melbourne Herald the next day. And it just quickly says, a quotation from Swinburne by the Prime Minister, Mr. Curtin, in his national broadcast last night has caused great interest amongst his friends. Mr. Curtin wrote the quotation from memory a few moments before his broadcast began because he thought it peculiarly appropriate as an invocation to the Australian people. Apart from his stirring appeal, the quotation has remarkable application to modern aerial warfare. So it was, people sort of pondered and talked about it at the end, but often to begin or end speeches, he would use poems, often just straight out of his head. What I found as I looked further into everything that's been digitized about his life, and there's a lot that's been digitized about his life, that poetry was part of his whole life. And there are, from his primary school days pretty much right through. And in the review in the Canberra Times of Good for the Soul, they talk about the interiority of him. And I think it really does show what's going on internally with someone who people remark was often externally hard to get a read on. But in his letters and his friendships and his politics as well, as a young man, he joined the Victorian Socialist Party, and Liam knows all about this too, and which is certainly set up in the model of British socialism, where they used a lot of sort of radical poetry, 19th century poetry in particular, Percy Shelley, also lots of Tennyson, the Bible, Shakespeare, and I have a list at the end, of all the different the poems by country that he's listening to and reading, mainly Anglophone poetry, particularly British, but also American, and that might have been one of the sources of his friendship with General Douglas MacArthur, that people have remarked on. They both knew American poetry very well and the high ideals of it at that point. And Curtin was also a huge fan of Australian poetry. He knew some of them personally, but often it was because it was very high-minded, moral, pro-worker poetry in particular. And there was also a lot of that's sort of the high-minded stuff, but there's also sort of the satirical sort of sketch poetry and stuff that you would see in most in journals. Most newspapers as well had a poetry editor, poetry section. Most journalists were sort of frustrated poets or writers, a few politicians as well. And it was no accident to see in Hansard around his time other people quoting poetry, quoting Henry Lawson, but also quoting Milton or Shakespeare, and across the different parties as well. I think to some degree it was symptomatic of a lot of people going through a similar sort of educational base, but of course many of his generation, particularly working class kids, didn't go to university, but they sort of made up for it with the labour movements, and also with left-wing newspapers and things like that. And so really poetry became for him it also became a kind of a great symbol of him as a labour intellectual. The biggest room in the Curtin house, which has been preserved and you can still visit, is a lounge room with book-lined walls, sort of a library / lounge room. And it's the biggest room in the house. It's the most impressive room in the house. It's where you take visitors straight in, it was designed to be like the photo on the front here. I've got him here in that bedroom, not bed, in the lounge room rather. Looking at an official document, but behind him is the sort of famous Curtin bookshelf, which journalists remarked had over 2,000 books, and he would. When he became Prime Minister 80 years ago, one of the first things he said to the press in the interviews about the new Prime Minister, because the Menzies government collapsed, there wasn't an election. He was sort of Prime Minister more or less overnight, and he told the press that not only did he stick to a Sunday night poetry reading ritual that he recommended to all Australians, but that every man should read poetry for the good of his soul. And this was something that he meant. It wasn't a gimmick. It was part of who he was, and it's part of the high ideals, but also sort of the consolations and the friendships in a lot of letters and speeches and things like that. A lot of people knew poetry by heart, and it's symptomatic of the pre-radio age, I think, and pre-television age, because at the end of the night, gathering with people, everyone's expected to perform something, sing something, or recite something, or know something by heart, or that kind of thing. You see that in Curtin's friendships, in his letters, in his courting of his future wife Elsie, and her father-in-law was a poet as well, so he was sort of surrounded by sort of other poets in the family. I found it wasn't that unusual for people to write light verse, or to have a volume of verses they put together or something like that. So there was sort of this life that was kind of awash with poetry in a lot of ways, and I ended up with far more than I bargained for.
So, I mean, you're obviously a member of the Curtin family, so you'd have closer insights than most of us. And the modern common take on Curtin barely scratches any of this sort of stuff. I mean, we know about the Stoic man, we know about the redemptive man, we know about the wartime leader. Why is this? Is it because our age has crowded this out, or is it just something that we don't pick up because we don't have the visual records? Because one thing I noted in going back over your book, I mean, you've mentioned tonight how voluminous the written records are, and your book is very comprehensive in terms of the written records of speeches, of poetry, references to poetry, his use of poetry in publications he edited. Yet in common with Ben Chifley also, we find very few tapes of Curtin speeches. We find very few films. Indeed, the one we tried to present tonight is one of the rare ones. And yet, while it includes references to poetry, this doesn't seem to have become absorbed in our popular consciousness. So did you have a bit of a head start? Was this a sort of common topic in the family as you grew up, or It was something that you sort of came to after a bit of scratching around.
Yeah, I sort of came to it eventually. My mother, born Barbara Curtin, is his granddaughter, and she was born 2 years after he died. But she also knew Elsie Needham, Elsie Curtin, as she became. Curtin's wife lived another 30 years until the mid-70s. So, and also the family stayed clustered around the same area of Cottesloe for quite a while as well. So I think things started to, I grew up not, like a block from the Curtin Avenue, and I talk at the start of the book about sort of playing at the Cottesloe Civic Centre, which is sort of, the municipal buildings, but also sort of playgrounds and things like that, where there's a statue of John Curtin. I used to run around that with other kids and stuff like that. And I was markers of what Gideon Hay calls Curtinalia around the place, particularly in WA, of course, but I think it's, as I sort of went to university at UWA, Curtin University as well, Curtin University was named, it was renamed from a different name, the WA Institute of Technology, I think it was before that. And then, of course, the John Curtin Library got going, and they would invite the family to various events, annual speeches, things like that, which was great. I got to see Gough Whitlam speak, and Paul Keating, and many other people, and as well as historians and scholars talking about Curtin. And for the 1995 50th anniversary of the end of the war celebrations, there was a big Australia Remembers campaign and stuff, and there was a lot around that which I started to sort of absorb a bit. And not long after that, Professor David Black, who was a great scholar of Curtin, put together edited collections of his letters as well as his speeches. And in the letters, you can see quite a bit of it. But I didn't really clue to it until a bit later. I knew there was a little bit around, but it wasn't until I'd become a scholar myself and published poetry myself and that kind of thing. There were sort of books in the family, and we did have some books from Curtin's era and a few things, but most of it had been donated to the John Curtin Library. So we didn't have that much of it around, but I visited the John Curtin house when I was a kid as well. My great aunt, Auntie Elsie, lived there, was Curtin's daughter. I hung out in that lounge room. So maybe that sort of all absorbed into me at that point. But it wasn't until I came back and I started to work as a scholar with the John Curtin Library, and I started to search through these huge databases by poets' names. I found Bernard O'Dowd or William Wordsworth or something like that. And once you put it into these databases, then rather than getting 1 or 2 hits, I was getting 20 or 30 hits quite often. And then it became a matter of trying to map that across, chronologically in different ways with other archival sources. I think what I did couldn't have been done before the digital age. Once things are digitized and you can search huge volumes, particularly by poets' names and things, it became a bit more obvious. But we don't really do literary historical biographies in Australia that much. And a lot of historians that come across some of the poetry, like they're doing these very big speeches, often say, what it's a reference to, and then move on very quickly. They don't discuss the deeper meaning or anything like that. So I thought I wanted to delve into that because I didn't think anyone else necessarily would. And it sort of fell to me in a way to do it.
Fair enough. So to what degree do you think Curtin's interest in things such as poetry and his commitment to self-development and, I suppose, intellectual exploration underpin his politics and his passions for national development and plans for post-war reconstruction? Are there threads there that come out of the poetry?
Yeah, certainly. He's sort of the way he was drawn to first, socialism and then into sort of Labor politics was really influenced in a very highly literary turn of century Melbourne, where he worked for Norman Lindsay for a little while on one of Lindsay's satirical journals as an impressionable teenager, because they were from the same town in Creswick in country Victoria. But
you might tell us about some of the links between the two families, because they are quite long-standing, aren't they?
Yeah, there's a few actually. Firstly, Norman Lindsay's father was a doctor, actually brought Curtin into the world to begin with. He was a doctor in the area. Then Norman Lindsay and some of the other Lindsays as well, Lionel and others were also very literary. Around Melbourne were starting their own literary magazines, trying to, based on Punch, this sort of satirical, lots of satirical verse and stuff like that. And it was one of Curtin's first jobs, was to work for them for not too long, about 3 months or so, until the whole thing collapsed. And then later on, Lindsay famously came up to Sydney and was working for the Bulletin and things like that. But also later, when in about 44, when Curtin went to London and you know, to see Churchill and to attend the Empire meeting there, he also got his hands on a copy of the poems of Jack Lindsay, the next generation as well. He was quite a good poet, actually, and at the time was having a big falling out with Norman, his father, probably due to his own sort of more communist politics rather than his father's quite conservative politics. So, but Curtin picked up and read his a collection of his poetry. I don't know if he met him in person. Could have at the time, but yeah, there's sort of 3 generations there in terms of their contact with John Curtin. And but I think also what you see in terms of that post-war reconstruction is an idea of an intellectual visionary country, a country, you know, he wanted to create Australian National University, ANU, for example, and things like that. And there's one brief speech, which if you just indulge me for a second, I just want to quickly read. From the book. And this was, he knew Dame Mary Gilmore personally, and she was in that older generation of socialist writers that he knew, and she corresponded with him. And then in 1942, August 42, so, you know, right in the depth of the war, he attended her 77th birthday party, which was held by the Henry Lawson Society in Sydney, in this Dickens-themed room and everything. At the last minute, Curtin was put on the bill to speak because I wasn't sure if he would be there or not, but he decided that he would. What he said that night was reported in the Daily Telegraph with all these other journalists there. And he sort of was, it sort of appeared in the paper as no censorship on poetry, Curtin tells the party. And he sort of was joking about whether or not poetry could be censored and stuff, because of course censorship was a big issue at the time. But he then goes on after that saying this really interesting statement, and this, you know, this is in a city that had been a couple of months previous had been attacked by a Japanese midget submarine. It was, you know, it was in the depths of the war, and what he says here about what Australia is to him is really interesting. You would think it would be a time for utmost pragmatism, and it was. But he says this, and this is how it's reported. Mr. Curtin added, Australia does not consist of the buildings around us, the thoroughfares, the munitions factories. It consists basically of human beings, not only their physical presence, but their mental capacities and, I believe, their spiritual purpose. How shall they express their individualities? Through the men of letters, the poets, thinkers, dreamers, artists, sculptors, and musicians. Without the collaboration of these, this country would be but a material place, well fed perhaps, but not happy or enduring. So, I mean, when I read that, I found it in NLA Trove. A few journalists reported on that he gave a speech, but only one reported it. He's talking about the need for dreamers and sculptors and musicians, you know, and poets and this kind of stuff in the middle of the war, right in the middle of the war. You would think it'd be the time to say, well, don't worry about all that, let's win the war and then deal with this arty stuff later. But with him, the two were fused. The two, that was what you were fighting for, was a more intellectual country which had more opportunity, more education. He was a great believer in universities as well as creative places, as well as just degree factories. And this was a central part of who he was. He was speaking to quite a literary audience that night, but he was calling for the need for, you know, dreamers in the middle of the war. You know, that was part of the enigma of him to some people, you know, that he would go off on these literary sort of tangents, but it was something that really mattered to him. It was all part of the same thing, and the role he saw for education in sort of rebuilding the country was particularly important. And you can see from the type of poetry that he liked and really promoted. A lot of it, you know, is very practical and a lot of rhyming verse and that kind of thing. But at that moment, that's one of the most interesting parts of the book for me, because he's talking about a vision of Australia, you know, right in the middle of the most desperate year of the war. And that was quite humbling to find that. It was one of a few discoveries that I found. I found my mum in one of Mary Gilmore's letters as well at one point, which was as a 2-year-old, which was quite interesting. But that moment for me explains what he thought the value of the arts was to Australia. He thought it was central, not something that's peripheral.
Yeah, which is fascinating because it's almost an Athenian vision. I mean, it's some might say it's quite ethereal, but then you also remember this was a man who was applying himself, to the practical nuts and bolts of organising a war effort, which hadn't been particularly well organised before he became Prime Minister, and also immediately upon assuming Prime Minister, very pointedly declaring that he was also about winning the peace as well as the war, and in terms of quite vigorous infrastructure, of growing the country, etc., the sorts of things that we talk about today, and yet it's accompanied by the sorts of things we perhaps don't talk about enough today, this cultural vision. So it is quite extraordinary. I hesitate to sort of interpolate here, but I can't resist, of course, letting people know, if they don't know already, that of course he was speaking at the 77th birthday of Scott Morrison's great aunt.
Yes, yeah, they're related. Yeah, absolutely.
Which there's a certain irony in that, and there's possibly another irony in that the most recent national leader to have quoted Gilmore about Australian nationhood was Donald Trump, perhaps unwittingly, not knowing that she was in fact a communist, I believe.
Yes, that's right. You can find this if you're looking up that Curtin speech on about the Declaration of War. You can get that on YouTube. That's one of his few speeches that has been retained. While you're on YouTube finding that, you can also find in 2019 when Donald Trump hosted Scott Morrison at the White House, and everyone was on their best behaviour, including Trump, unbelievably. And he, as part of his sort of welcoming speech as host, he reading from the script, mentioned and actually read out some of Dame Mary Gilmore's "No Foe Shall Gather Our Harvest," which was a poem she'd written sort of in defiance of Japanese invasion or attack in a couple of years before, I think the year before Curtin became Prime Minister. And so, yeah, you can actually listen to Donald Trump reading Dame Mary Gilmore if you're in a funny mood. But the whole event is quite interesting. And then, I mean, Morrison has acknowledged Dame Mary Gilmore and recognised their politics probably could not be more different, and as things are in families sometimes. And but he has read out some of her war poems before at Anzac Day and things like that as well. So it's not something that he particularly hides, but he certainly doesn't go into her social poems about poverty a heck of a lot. And I sort of make that point that for Dame Mary Gilmore, Curtin was almost this. She kind of lionized him in her writing about him, and even wrote poems about John Curtin crossing the sea to. With Abraham Lincoln arm in arm, and called him Australia's Lincoln. And after he died in 45, there was a lot of this, "Oh, Captain, my Captain," Walt Whitman kind of, comparing Curtin to Abraham Lincoln and things like that, which fed off American poetry.
Right, yeah. The remembrance, perhaps provides a good point to segue across to Liam. I was just wanting to explore whether it's possible to isolate any particular factor that does most to make Curtin resonate so strongly with politically and historically literate Australians, often across the political divide. He's a man who became PM after the war had begun and died weeks before it ended, literally. So his whole leadership, in some senses, has been defined by that, because that's what we remember. But his government, as Toby's alluded to, also put in place programs of post-war reconstruction. What's the relevant significance of these two aspects of his leadership to the way he's now regarded, Liam?
Thanks, David, and g'day to the 120 plus people who are signing in to watch this. It's really, really great to see so many people coming together to talk history and to talk about Curtin. I don't think this happens enough in our public life, so it's really, really wonderful have you all here with us, but a particular shout out and hello to mum and dad. It's great that you're online. Who are in a different state to me as well, I should say. So because of everything that's happening, it's we don't get to see each other enough. So I put on this collared shirt for them. So I hope you're pleased with that. David, on the question, I think one of the things that really struck me when I was writing the book Becoming John Curtin and James Scullin, it begins with without, people tell me all the time, Liam, your book is good, but you gave away the ending on the first page, because I begin with Curtin passing away and the sort of just the wave of sort of like national mourning that really swept through. And I talk in particular about James Scullin's mourning of Curtin, the things that he said, but it's also, Menzies is paying tribute. You have tributes coming from the King of England. You have American sort of people who sort of putting across their sort of sympathies as well. And all of that, as you kind of expect, he's head of a government, he's somebody who's played an important role. But the thing that really struck me when looking at the report at the time was firstly what a lot of the journalists were saying. And it was quite common to say Curtin is one of the war dead. He's a casualty of the war, which, I actually think, actually, that makes a lot of sense. And I'd agree with that in many quite significant ways. But there's just this little sort of bit of reportage from the King's Hall where Curtin was lying in state after he passed away, where there's these two women who were there to pay tribute to him. And one says to the other, and they're overheard and it's reported, I guess this is the first time he's had any peace since he's been in this place. And that really struck me hearing that, the sort of thing about, well, what were people on the ground? Because when we talk about remembrance, of course, there are other politicians, of course, but I mean, the people who actually matter most in politics are the public, working people, Australian, but, the people, the citizenry. And for them, he was somebody who was deeply loved, which is quite strange in some ways when we think about it. He spent most of his political career as Prime Minister demanding sacrifice and telling people the sort of things that they were not going to get, which usually you would say would be political suicide from someone to constantly do that. But at that moment where it really mattered, and Toby mentioned before the failed prime ministership of Robert Menzies in the early stages of the war, and then Arthur Fadden, of course, for his famous 40 days. But these people did not provide the leadership that Australia needed. But in that moment, when nobody else seemed to be able to do it, this guy who wasn't massively well known, who was actually quite reluctant, who seemed a little bit aloof, who seemed a little bit different, he was the one who was there. He stood up and he took the responsibility and he did it. And when he called for sacrifice, he sacrificed himself. When he called for the nation to work to exhaustion, he visibly worked to exhaustion. He was somebody who people could see as a person of substance, of a person of sincerity, who they could put their hopes with, because at that void, he was there as a leader. And I think you can see that today. That exact same yearning exists in a time of national crisis. People want somebody to believe in, but they want more than just somebody who's going to manage the situation. And I think if you look at now, like I'm in Victoria, I think there's a very clear reason why Dan Andrews has got such incredible resonance here, and in other states that there's such a connection to premiers, because people see them playing that leadership role that the federal government is not. But the additional element, as you mentioned, was that under Curtin, the sacrifice that people were making, Australian people were making, was going to be redeemed, because he didn't just promise that there would be a better future after the war. He took the practical action to begin to put it into place. And of course, it wasn't just Curtin. It was, of course, Chifley, the Treasurer and Minister of Post-War Reconstruction, a great friend. It was the whole government. But and it was also many in the public service. I think Stuart McIntyre's got that wonderful book on post-war reconstruction, which is behind me actually, where it talks about the role of public servants like Nugget Coombs and so on. I think Stuart's a little bit wrong in his assessment of Curtin, but that's by the by. But this is a whole endeavour, but it was led by Curtin, and it could only be led by Curtin. He was the one who had the vision, who he developed over decades, who was able to speak to people with conviction and belief, and people would believe him, and they responded to that. So I think the integral thing is that you can't divorce his wartime leadership from that vision of the post-war era. Because Curtin wasn't like Churchill when it comes to post-war leadership. Churchill actively intervened in a series of military decisions. Curtin didn't do that. But what he did do was provide that sort of sense of national endeavour, that idea of collective endeavour, that we were all involved in something, that we were all making a sacrifice together to achieve an aim that was going to be good for Australia. And that sacrifice would be redeemed by the creation of a more egalitarian country after the war. Now, I do have to just sort of like do a little sort of qualifier there, is that, I don't think that we should look at the post-war era, which did create, it really advanced social equality to an extent that hadn't existed before in Australia. I don't think that we should glamorize that from our perspective today and say, oh, we should recreate that, exactly. I mean, it was still a time of great inequality. There were still exclusions from those great social progress that was made. And it's important to keep that in mind. Think about racial exclusion in particular, gender division. Like, we must remember that this is part of that history and we can't write that out. But it is true that if you look at it, that the advances in social equality that happened in that era were completely unprecedented in Australian history, and it did transform the lives of millions of people. Just as it didn't, the commitment to artistic world didn't begin, didn't say, oh, well, we'll leave that till later on, but for now we'll talk about this. They didn't leave the construction of that Birtle Wheel till later. They actively undertook it as part of the war. And I think that you can sort of see now for so many people, and I'm one of those people, I always think history reflects on today, and that's an important part of the conversation. I think this is one of the big things that's missing for so many people today, is that we're sacrificing and we're giving so much. But where is that hope coming from any kind of national government that that sacrifice is going to be redeemed by the creation of a better Australia afterwards? Well, I think that is the crucial missing part of leadership today, and that is exactly what Curtin was able to deliver.
I might sort of pick you up on that point and get you to elaborate on, points of detail about what you mean. In your book, you do point to, some of these potential parallels of the time. And if we were to look back on the entirety of Curtin's leadership of the Labor Party, going back to 1934, we can pick up things that might resonate to analysis of today's situation quite a lot. There's a declining faith in formal institutions. There was rising inequality, and there was a diminished, in historical terms, consensus for reform. People were all over the shop like Brown's cows when Curtin assumed the leadership of the Labor Party, and that by 1941 he was able to articulate a very coherent, very detailed vision, and more to the point, delegate to people, like Holloway, Deadman, Chifley, even draw on the internal strengths of people like Spence, who perhaps came from a different, tradition in the Labor Party. What are the lessons that we can learn if we study Curtin more deeply and study books like Toby's that we can apply today, or are the times too different?
No, I don't. What I always think of history, like it's really, history has warnings, but not blueprints. I always sort of like to think is that there's a huge amount that we can learn about it, but we, of course, we can't just like uncritically recreate it because the world has changed. I mean, that's the point, is that the world is constantly changing, and people like Curtin help to change it. They advance things down, and the point is not to try and just recreate it, but to learn from some of the things that they went through, and to, I think, have that hope that change is actually possible and it's something that can be achieved. I'm also really pleased that you mentioned Holloway. Jack Holloway is somebody I write about in my book who I don't think gets talked about enough and has been forgotten to history. And anybody who wants to hear a whole bunch of really, I think, interesting stories about him, including the fact that he was the first person to unseat a sitting prime minister in an election. I am your person. I'll be able to do that whenever you want. But I think that some of the really important things to think, people talk about the historic decline of the Labor Party at the moment, and people talk about, the receding vote share of the Labor Party. People talk about the Labor Party not having ideals. And basically say it is a spent force for transformative change. People who think that today would gain a lot from looking at the Labor Party immediately after the Great Depression and the split that took place, and the really terrible state that the party was in. That it was divided. It was something, it was literally divided, and so a whole chunk of it from New South Wales had left the party under Jack Lang. It was seen by many as being a spent force. But there's a reason why the Labor Party was able to reconstruct itself before it reconstructed Australia, and of course, it was John Curtin who did that. And that was a painful process. And I think, one of the important lessons about politics is actually it's really hard. It actually takes ages to get stuff done. And there's a lot of sacrifice required. I mean, Curtin himself was constantly doubting his ability to lead the party after he came to office. And it's a great quote where he's like, oh, this is a job for a younger man, because he just felt tired. He felt exhausted. Because one of the things that he did was he went around to all the different branches and all the different states and talked to people. He talked to union members. He talked to Labor branch party members. And he learnt about them, their lives, their needs, what they wanted, their experiences. He had that direct sort of contact. And then, of course, he became really, really well known. So even though he wasn't that well known outside of the party, one of the reasons why he was able to have the leadership he did was because he was well known and loved within it. Because over years, he set that sort of trajectory. And he set all that sort of stuff in place. And we talk about where his vision came from. Like, John Curtin did not come up with the idea of post-war reconstruction in 1941. Like, he didn't become prime minister and go, actually, do you know what would be a really good idea? The exact nature of it, of course, was determined at a later stage, but he was making these arguments as early as this First World War. I've got this bit in a book where he says, explicitly in 1915, How can we possibly have a situation where, you know, the government says you cannot intervene into the economy, that the market will collapse, that it will be a devastation until a war breaks out, and then all of a sudden it's okay to do whatever you want. Like, you can intervene, you can take over what you control, that's fine, but apparently you can't use those exact same measures to wage a war on want and poverty. Like, how is that you know, something that's being allowed? And of course he was a younger person then, he was more radical and so on and so on. But I don't think it's as big a gap between that and during the Second World War saying, okay, we are going to use the full measure of resources that we have to make transformation through the measure of the state and the economic power that we have. It is not that giant a journey, even though of course he wasn't a radical socialist anymore and so on. So I think the things that we can learn is that even though in particular moments people are willing to give up, particularly on Labor as the party of social change, Labor will always remain the party of transformative change in Australia as long as it's connected to and reflects the experiences of working people. And the reality is that working people, the workforce, have drastically transformed since the Second World War. In many ways, that's a really, really great thing. You can see all those sort of changes and greater diversity and so on, and that needs to be reflected and that needs to be part of it. But as long as Labor is connected to that mission, then Labor will remain the party of social transformation in Australia. But I don't like to quote Tony Blair too often for obvious reasons. But in a much derided New Statesman article he recently wrote, there is one thing he said that I really agreed with about the British Labor Party, which I think applies to Labor in Australia, where he said, Labor doesn't have an inherent right to exist. Like, it doesn't have a right. You have to earn that right. You have to earn the trust. Now, I don't agree with like anything he said about how the party should do that, like literally not a single thing. But in that point, I think he's right, that Labor has to constantly re-earn our right to represent working people by doing the things and by enunciating the policies, and most importantly, having the worldview and the vision about the kind of society that we want to create to earn that trust and to earn that sort of connection. And that is the lesson of Curtin, is that it is possible. And one of the things that I've noticed most with the reviews, sorry, I know I'm going on, I apologize, but I'm a historian. Once I get started, it's very, very difficult to stop me. One of the things I've noticed a lot with the reviews of the book is that there's so many people who are, when I talk to people about it, who are really enthused, because they're like, you know, it's really nice to see people who are hopeful. Where a lot of people, reviews, particularly from, I don't want to sound snide or anything here, but, you know, particularly from people who, let's say, have found a certain niche in society which sort of like benefits with things being the way that they are, have often sort of derided it as being like, it's well researched, but, you know, I think he's a bit optimistic, this guy who thinks that the Labor Party can still affect change. And I think it's a bit much and so on and so on. And I think it's interesting because that's cynicism towards change. On one hand, I get it because politics is hard and it's difficult and you have to sacrifice to get things done. I understand why people are, are pushing against that. But I can't imagine a more powerful force for those who are in the social elite and who want things to stay the way they are than cynicism. This idea that things can't change. I mean, what benefits Scott Morrison more than this idea that politics is just bankrupt? You don't need an ICAC because that's just the way that they're always going to be. Let's not change things. Let's just leave it as we are. Like, this benefits the people who don't want things to change. To me, Curtin is an antidote to cynicism. And the lesson from Curtin is, yes, it's hard. Yes, it takes a long time, but it can be done.
Well, on that note, Liam, I mean, I'll just say I'm going to open to audience questions in a minute. And what I'd like people to do is pose their questions via the Q&A function. And that way we can get to them faster rather than spreading them into the chat. But you've displayed some intensity, and we might conclude our discussion on the topic of intensity. And
I get told that a lot, David, I should say.
Well, I'll throw it to both of you so you can share the intensity. But is part of the problem for today's politicians that their development as parliamentarians is sort of no longer strengthened by intense contests about ideas, as, for example, both Curtin and Scullin were, and, you know, as you've illustrated, Toby, and, you know, the depth of work that Curtin put into some of his arguments and to his rhetoric and to carrying his arguments with his rhetoric. Is that the sort of issue, that people are not forged in the battle of ideas as much as they used to be, or is that a remembrance of things past that perhaps is not really true?
Do you want to go, Liam, or should I?
Why don't you go, then I'll have a...
Sure. Yeah, I think the forges are still there, but they've changed. I think they've become different, and I think now you've got kind of perhaps the forge of social media and many other forging experiences. I think I was actually, writing particularly the wartime chapters as COVID broke out. And in some ways, it was almost a relief to be in another kind of crisis, as dire as that was. But it did set me thinking about how Curtin would have dealt with something like COVID. And I think, he did have one of his friends, best friends, Frank Hyatt, killed by the Spanish flu. And so he did have, he was affected from that era. But I think there's something in it. And that's often why people go back to the Curtin house. I guess there's some sort of innocence there. The Curtins didn't own a car. They fitted the model of sort of wartime austerity already, even before it happened, in a way that a lot of people could could recognise. I think looking at politics today, I think there are still some really great people. I think there's a lot of really good people out there, and there were certainly some rotten politicians back in the day as well. And I think now, though, there's a lot more managing of what's said and how it's said, and talking points and all that kind of thing. And very few politicians sort of have are sort of given the leeway to sort of riff off on a subject, because that
does crisis give them the leeway to be
a little
leaders?
Yeah. I think we've seen with even with the state premiers and things like that, that's once they realise crisis, you do get a lot of the population locking in behind you, but you also get others resisting it to some degree, and you've got to sort of figure out this middle ground that's going to work and appeal to the greater majority of people, but also kind of appeal to the better side of people. And that's something which I haven't seen in the Australian COVID response, for all the good things that have been done. There hasn't. I was always wondering, okay, where's the information campaign? Where's the public campaign? Where's calling on people's sense of community and self, and where's I don't know, various Aussie celebrities saying come on Australia and stuff. There's been bits, but it hasn't been done in a coordinated kind of way, especially from someone with such marketing background. But I think that's part of the problem, is that there's a lot of people getting their messages now can feel how much they've been manipulated, because people are that much more educated as well. They can feel when messages are manipulated. They can feel when things are sort of half sentences or weasel words, or something leaving the door open for something else, or someone like Maurice Payne, who just speaks in abstractions linked to abstractions linked to abstractions in this managerial kind of way. Well, that doesn't give people any hope. It maybe solves a problem of dampening down some kind of issue as perhaps crisis management, but it doesn't give people hope. And I think people need that going in. And I'm hoping, in the 2020s, we're going to see a return to an emphasis on the importance of not just education, but respect for expertise as well, respect for science, respect for the arts, literature, etc. But I think there'll also be a loud percentage who won't go with that can't be appealed to, or take some time to turn around. But I was really, even in the 30s, in the Depression, Curtin was writing about the importance of universities. They have this up at Curtin University inscribed on a wall, talking about the importance of universities, but as creative places, and the importance of creativity in being hand in hand with change. So creativity thinks ahead. I think it was Shelley that said, one of Curtin's favourite poets, who said that the poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. They're the ones who sort of think of the change and imagine change before it starts to become policy and reality. And there's also that long-held statement that you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. I think some of the time Curtin was governing in poetry as well, and there's no problem with that, as long as it's tied to something that's he really believed in. And these weren't just statements, as Liam was saying. He was putting this into legislation. He was putting this into actual transformational change. And that included also improving pensions for writers, increasing funds to magazines like Salt, which published poems by people in the army and things like that, and sort of making it okay to for a country to have an intellectual or a literary or a side like this. I think we certainly got the bad end of economic rationalism, and I certainly did in the late 90s and since. And one of the things it hates most is creativity, economic rationalism. my partner Erin was one thing she said about this book is you know, she's grown up with economic racialism as well, but she said a lot of it felt like a warm hug from another generation. Like, it's okay to be intellectual, it's okay to love poetry, it's okay to see an artistic vision of Australia, and that's not anti-national, that's not anti-Australian, that's not you know, we can have an expanded view of our own country. And just one little thing, I mean, we've dealt with a lot of heavy material, but also there's a lot of light stuff used during the war, a lot of light verse and that kind of thing, that's, you know, was published to keep people's spirits up and stuff like that, and sort of mocking poetry or, you know, satirical, but also all poking fun of black humour, how dark the war was. But given that it's 80 years tomorrow since the formation of the Curtin Government, there was according to several sources at least anyway, to the tune of There'll Always Be in England, there was a play at the time on called I'd Rather Be Left, and they had their own version of this called There'll Always Be a Menzies, and my parents told me they sung this to the tune of There'll Always Be in England, but apparently this was sung as a kind of a mock dirge for Menzies at the first meeting of the formation of the new Curtin Government. And you can imagine them sitting there sort of singing this, and I won't sing it, but the lines are, there'll always be a Menzies while there's a BHP, for they have drawn their dividends since 1883. There'll always be a Menzies, for Menzies never fails, so long as nothing happens to the Bank of New South Wales. If we should lose our Menzies, whatever should we do? For Menzies means as much to me as Menzies means to you. And that was sort of sung apparently at the beginning of that meeting 80 years ago tomorrow.
Okay, so as you suggest, it wasn't all heaviness. There was a bit of levity too.
No, and that was a bit of relief, I think, as well. And one, Curtin was known for his heavy moods and sort of depressions and things like that. And the way to pull him out of that was for someone to read poetry to him or recite Clancy of the Overflow. And there were sort of different people who could do that. And even sometimes, yeah, indeed, Chifley would go over to him and read the Bible with him and things like that, even though Curtin was certainly an ex-Catholic. That all those kinds of things were known as ways to lift his spirits, was to either read or talk about poetry, and he did that with journalists too.
Right.
I think there's so Dave, it comes back to the question you raised about, you know, the heat of contests and the way it generates ideas and so on, and sort of roles plays in public life, where I think that it does need to be said that there is a paucity of this in modern politics, and we lose as a citizenry and we lose as a nation because of that. And you know, if you look at Curtin, this is deeply earned knowledge. Like, you know, he was like most working class kids at the time. He left school at 13, and he went to the series of different jobs. You know, in a book, I've got the sort of stories about him talking about his time as an estimator at Titan and just hating it, spending his whole life basically saying, well, all I do is this dull, menial labor for someone who makes money off it, and I don't care for them. I don't care what happens, and this is what my life is, and it's terrible. And then, you know, that then leads to him becoming a union official and a union leader and so on and so on. There's a deeply lived experience there about the reality of life that he had and that other people had. Chifley definitely had it as well, and other people in Labor. And unfortunately, this is not represented enough in modern politics, is that thing of having to earn knowledge, because actually most of your life is spent working in the actual workforce. And in a lot of that sort of, you know, things which is, let's just say, like, I think that engaging in poetry and literature, and that's something that's been very important to my life, and I know my family's life and so on, it means more when you are grasping at that after an 8, 9, 10-hour workday, when that is the thing that you find refuge in. That means more to you, I think. It gives a deeper sort of resonance to that stuff. But also, Curtin had to spend 9 out to 10 hours in the factory, and then he would go and teach himself about economics. And the economics that informed post-war Reconstruction came from that. And I don't agree with all of his economics. I think some of the things he said were totally wrong and a bit problematic. But that's the basis of where these sort of ideas sort of come from. It was earned knowledge. We don't see that as much today. And I think that all of politics, not entirely, but all of politics suffers from this. And the Labor Party in particular. I'm not one of these people who just attacks professional politicians, because I think professional politicians offer a lot to politics and they provide a lot of insight and knowledge, but they are overrepresented right now. Just like lawyers are clearly overrepresented in Parliament. It's not to say that there shouldn't be lawyers. I think it's wonderful. But where are the nurses? You've got Jed Carney, which is wonderful. But as I say now, where are the other healthcare workers? Where are the cleaners? Where are the people who know about logistics and transport because they actually do the work? This is knowledge. This is expertise. Understanding the reality of working life and working experience. Where is that? There's not enough of it. And the Labor Party is only going to regenerate and grow and redevelop and reconnect when we reconnect and make sure that that sort of vision is innately part of who we are. That is the knowledge. That is a heated contest that we need to bring back, is knowledge of the actual working reality of the world that we live in.
We must allow some time for some questions. No, that said, in your passion, you've managed to answer several of the questions already posed. But I suppose the lesson, you know, apart from the sort of the dedication and life's experience that you're both touching on, is that we should perhaps be looking, or our leaders should be looking to appeal to the better angels of our nature, but we should also be recognising the better angels of our natures ourselves. I'll go to a quite specific question, which neither of you touched on. Peter Sinclair asked earlier on, what was the relationship between General MacArthur, who's a controversial figure, and Curtin? In Peter's impression, MacArthur seems to have helped Curtin have better access to Roosevelt than he perhaps might have, given the interference that Churchill used to run in higher council, as it were, amongst the Allies against Curtin with Roosevelt. Would anyone like to touch on that?
Yeah, just say that's right. I mean, the situation of the Australian war. I mean, again, this is one of the things that's important to remember about Australia at this time, was that Australia remained within the British Empire. It was a dominion. You know, in 1939, when the European War began, of course, the Second World War actually began with the Japanese Empire's invasion of China in 1937. But when the European War began, was that Australia was at war an hour and a half later without a formal declaration. It was just Britain's at war and so are we. That was the kind of way that it worked. So Australia's ability to control. Other thing is, like, don't forget, like, when Curtin was combating Churchill about whether or not the divisions from the Middle East were going to come back to Australia or they're going to be sent to India, at one point, Churchill just redirected the boats. Like, they just had this sort of attitude towards Australia that this is just a part of, you know, we will tell them what to do and that's the way it works. And when the Americans and the British, when the Americans did enter the war, they came to the decision to prioritise the European theatre over the Pacific theatre without Australia even being represented. So, like, Australia was in an extremely difficult, and Curtin in particular was an extremely difficult position in just getting any information, let alone influence over the decisions that were being made. And so there was a real sort of connection with MacArthur. I think you can sort of see where Curtin played the situation really, really well. And there's a lot you can criticise about it and so on. But actually, apart from anything else, to get information and to all of a sudden have, for the first time, an advocate for, you know, the common interests that Australia and America had within that relationship, which before hadn't really existed. And it meant that Australia didn't have to go through Britain to try and influence America. So even though it's a strange partnership, and I'm definitely not somebody who's going to be lauding MacArthur or anything like that, it was one that actually had really serious strategic benefits for Australia. And, you know, at the end of the day, that's what Curtin was about.
Yeah, could I just add to that briefly? And I mean, John Edwards writes beautifully about this in John Curtin's War. But one thing I uncovered a little bit independently is, well, I mean, firstly, yeah, you know, MacArthur fled the Philippines, came to Australia at, you know, March 42, when things are really dire. He has this sort of messianic arrival. Everyone's so glad to see him. And you can understand why, because things are as grim as they have been in the start of 42, and mainland Australia attacked, and Darwin bombed and so forth. So his arrival was a kind of security, and certainly Curtin and MacArthur needed each other in all kinds of ways. Their politics were very different, of course. And yeah, MacArthur Republican and everything like that. But I think one thing that historians have missed, and I mentioned this a little bit in Good for the Soul, is that MacArthur loved poetry, had poetry up on the walls of his offices, wrote some pretty bad poetry of his own, and as did Curtin a little bit here and there. And that's just in the back of the book. But one thing about it, and there's a bit of evidence for this in terms of Curtin talking to others about MacArthur, is that he compared MacArthur's arrival to this Byronic figure, almost like Byron himself. You know, he was this larger than life sort of blustering figure. But actually, he said that they talked about Emerson and Emerson's poetry, and Emerson's with Ralph Waldo Emerson, and also Whitman. Walt Whitman was another favourite of Curtin's. I'm sure was a favourite of MacArthur's, and the New England school of poets like Longfellow, James Russell Lowell, Henry Greenleaf Whittier. These very sort of high moralistic philosophical poets. that Curtin knew and knew long before he ever met MacArthur. I think that was part of, they sort of had some common ground there as well, and that informed at least some element of the friendship. There was an intellectual friendship in there, which was partly literary.
So it was not just Curtin reading the man, as it were. You think there was some genuine depth
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think there was something that couldn't be faked there about, and they both were very well aware that they're in the depths of the fight of their lives, both of them, and in very different ways. And they were very different personalities. And but Curtin was used to dealing with pretty extreme personalities. The Labor Party made sure of that, and and he for his whole life had in putting the Labor Party together, he had to deal with some very overpowering personalities, and MacArthur was certainly one of those. And he'd give these great speeches, talking about chivalric values and back to King Arthur and all this kind of stuff at Parliament House when he arrived. So he had all these very high idealistic views of what he was doing. There's even a verse that was sung by Australian servicemen about MacArthur when he finally dies, going to heaven and say, "Move over, God, it's Mac, move over, God, I'm here finally." There was no limit to the ego of the guy, but at the same time, in the middle of a crisis, that's someone that the population takes a great deal of relief in, knowing that there's someone who has this sort of unvanquishable spirit about them, even if they are very over the top.
Mm. Well, look, on that note, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because we've run to time. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and certainly some different perspectives from those that are commonly retailed about Curtin from both of you. I commend both of the books. As I said earlier, they're available at all good bookstores. Liam's book is from Melbourne University Press, and Toby's is from UWA Press. But both of you, I'd like to thank you tonight, and I'd like to thank everyone who logged on tonight as well to listen to tonight's Chifley conversation. We'll be taking a bit of a break next week, but we'll be back on the 20th, which is getting close to the lead up to the G20 in Rome towards the end of the month, and then, of course, the COP conference in Glasgow. So we'll be looking a bit further afield than Australia, and we'll certainly be departing from wartime leadership to look at some other areas of policy. So on that note, I'd like to finish again with the words inscribed on Curtin's tomb. His country was his pride, his brother man his cause. And from what you've told us tonight, it's very clear that his toil for both his pride and his cause were not in vain. And I'd like to leave you with some words which I think are very appropriate to both time of war and our current time of pandemic. And it's in the spirit of Liam's optimism. Dark times eventually will pass, but hope endures. And with that, good night. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you.